You can, yes. Yeah.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Thursday Bible Study here on the Journey Church Facebook page and in our sanctuary for those of you that are joining us in person today. We are in Esther chapter 3 today. We are going to look at Haman's plan, the start of his plan to kill off all the Jewish people. And again, Esther chapter 3 is where we're going to be looking at today.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we are making our way through this story, which is it's like a Greek play. You know, it has a plot and all these twists and turns, and you know, we talk about poetic justice. You know how we see all these kind of aspects taking place here, but it's not just a work of literature. This is a true account, and all these things that we call poetic justice and all this, or karma, or whatever we might call it. You know what goes around comes around. We use all those terms. It's really God. That's the underlying theme of this. And we repeat it every week. God is at work in our circumstances and behind the scenes, even though and even when we don't see him. Do you believe that, right? That's really one of the main themes that comes through. And again, we said God's name is not even mentioned in the book of Esther. And that's interesting because it kind of goes along with this theme, that even though you don't see God, he's everywhere in this book of Esther. You can see, in other words, the results of his activity in the lives of Esther and Mordecai and the Persian government and the kingdom of Persia. God is at work behind all of those things, even though in this book is the only book in the Bible where the name of God does not appear. So it just says, just because you don't see God does not mean that God is not at work. Amen? So it's a matter of, it just reminds us to trust God, to keep our faith in God, even when circumstances seem to be out of control, when we're forced into situations that we didn't ask for, like Esther and Mordecai, who were there in Persia, not in their own design, but they were forced there, taken captive, and from their homeland. But it was all in God's purposes. Remember, we quoted the verse in Proverbs last week that we make plans, but it's God's purpose that prevails. That God's purpose always prevails over our plans, which is why when we make plans, we should always submit them in our hearts to God's purpose. And so we can see evil people's plans here being foiled and God's purpose prevailing over evil people. That's another thing we can be assured of. We feel like maybe someone's coming against us, or circumstances are against us, or there's some evil plot to destroy us. Who knows what these kinds of things that happen in our lives. Maybe a coworker or even a family member who we think's against us. And you know what? We don't have to worry about that. We can entrust that to the Lord and trust ourselves to the Lord and say, Lord, you can override any plans of any evil that is planned against me. And so the safest place to be is when we entrust ourselves into God's plan, and he can take care of all those other things and other people that we might think are against us. So again, just to reiterate that overall theme, which I think is just an encouraging theme to reiterate. Now, just to reiterate the chain of events so far, because again, to get the whole sort of impact of this book, we need to remember sort of how things unfold. So I just want to do that briefly before we get into chapter 3 this week. The story surrounds Esther, who's a young Jewish woman, and her older cousin Mordecai. And we discover that Mordecai has raised Esther more or less as a father, because both her parents had died when she was a child. We don't know under what circumstances they died, but they died, and she was basically adopted by her cousin Mordecai. At the opening of the book of Esther, Esther and Mordecai are living in the city of Susa, which is the capital or one of the capital cities of the Persian Empire. Now, they weren't there on vacation, we find out. They had been taken captive some years earlier with many other Jews and carried away from their homeland, which would have been Judah in Israel, and resettled in what was now the kingdom of Persia. Now, this again was against their will. And this is another note we just sort of made earlier. It was against their will. They didn't ask to be deported from their homeland to a foreign land. It wasn't their plan, but still God was in it. That's the point. And we see that as this unfolds. Sometimes we have to wait to see God's purpose. In the immediate circumstances, we think, well, how can this be God? How can be kidnapped from my home country and taken to a foreign country against my will? How can that be God's plan? Well, wait, right? And as we see the book of Esther, we see God's purpose in it. God doesn't have to show us his will. He can direct us into his will if he chooses to, just by circumstance. You know, we think, oh, God's got to tell me his will so I can do it. No, he doesn't. God doesn't have to tell us his will. He can just arrange circumstances and more or less force us, come on, into his will. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And again, God would do that? Yeah. Circumstances we would not have chosen, in other words. Would if you were Esther and Mordecai, would you have chosen to be deported from your homeland to a foreign? They would have never chosen those circumstances. But was it in the plan of God in retrospect? Mm-hmm. Or the purpose of God? Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Would you say when it comes to God's will that it's better to pray, Lord, help me to walk in your will, instead of just maybe show me what your will is? Maybe just, Lord, arrange everything to help me to walk in your plan, maybe than necessarily asking him to walk in that.
Yeah, I think the attitude of the heart is the most important. I mean, the verse that always comes to mind is, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Think about it. This is really sort of a formula. You don't like to say the Bible has formulas, but you could almost say this as a formula. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, number one. Mm-hmm. Lean not to your own understanding. Those two things go together. You can't trust in the Lord and lean to your own understanding. See, they're mutually exclusive. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't trust in yourself. In other words, lean not to your own understanding. Then thirdly, in all your ways, acknowledge him. Now, this is a heart matter. Mm-hmm. That's to say, I'm going to have plans. I'm going to move forward with my life, but I'm always going to acknowledge God in all of my plans. And so it's more of an attitude of the heart. The Lord looks at the heart. So so acknowledge him in all your ways. And then what's the fourth outcome? The fourth phrase is the outcome of all that. And he will direct your path, or he will make your path straight. So I think it is. It's a matter of submission.
He's already given us the path to what he wants us to do. He's already given us the path to walking in his will, and it's doing those.
I think so.
Doing those things that you.
Yeah, which are all come down to a matter of trusting and submitting.
They're not easy.
No, they're not. But underlying it is this factor too, and we see this in Esther, that God has a plan for our lives. I mean, as Christians, that should put a smile on our face. We think, oh, what am I supposed to do with my life? What does God want? Listen, it's not what you're supposed to do with your life. It's discovering what God has already planned for your life. That's how we find out what our life is about. So we say, Lord, you're asking maybe how we should pray. Our prayer should be, Lord, help me to walk in my destiny, if you will. Remember when he called Jeremiah? And he said to him, I knew you before you were formed in your mother's womb, and I ordained that you would be a prophet. In other words, before you were even conceived, Jeremiah, I already knew who you were and what you were going to do, your life's mission. And I think we can apply that to ourselves, that God knew us before we were formed in our mother's womb. That makes us valuable. I'm valued by God. He cares about me and my life. And I was conceived, not just by the will of my parents, but God. I'm here because God has me here, and he has a plan for my life. It also reminds you of Ephesians, where it says, we're God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which he planned in advance for us to do. Think about it, or to walk in. So God has specific works and plans. Now, do we know what those are ahead of time? No. See, this kind of plays into the question too. It's not, that doesn't mean God has to show us a blueprint. Now, this is your life. Here's where you're going to be at 20, and here's where you're going to be at 50, and here's where you're going to be at 75. No, God, I don't know of anybody he's ever done that with. He could if he wanted to, but I don't think he usually does that. So we're walking in his will. He directs us usually step by step, and this is why it requires constant submission to him. If he were to show us his plan, we would depend on ourselves. Since we have to trust him for every step, it requires us to stay humble and submitted and trusting in him. And in that sense, he can direct us. And oftentimes we find God's will looking back. We want to see it ahead of time. Mm-hmm. But more times than not, we look back and we say, oh, God was leading me. I didn't even know it.
That's what he was
so
doing.
It's ironically, we often find God's will in retrospect. Mm-hmm. Not prospectively, retrospectively. We want to see it ahead of time. God says, well, it's okay. No, you just trust me, and you'll look back sooner or later, and you'll find out I was leading you. You just trust me. Mm-hmm. Don't you worry about it. You just trust me. That's your job. Again, the first three of those things is our job. The last one is God's. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not to your own understanding. That's our job. The fourth one has nothing to do with us. And he will direct your path. So we take care of the first three, which basically says trust God, mm-hmm. and he'll take care of the outcome, the fourth one. I'll direct your path, will you?
Yeah. We walk in the light that we have.
Yes.
And as we walk in what we know is the will of God currently, and then he will open up whatever else he has for us.
Yes.
That's the way I look at it. Hey, I'm here. This is what God's put me. I leave the future to him. I'm just doing what I know to do at this point.
Absolutely.
In my life.
I think you see that all through Scripture. I mean, here's the key we need to fully engage where you are. Amen. See, a lot of people are looking for God's will out there. No, God's will begins right where you are today. Are you fully engaged, doing everything that your hand can find to do to serve the Lord right where you are? Yep. And I'm just waiting around. Well, you're going to keep waiting around, probably, or God's going to have to bring some circumstance to jolt you out of your apathy. I better be doing something here. But if we're serving God where we are.
Yeah, and also over 90% of God's will, it's already written.
Yes.
If we just do that 90%, the other percentage will take care of itself.
I believe that's true. I believe even maybe 99.
Yep.
I think we're trying to find God's will we don't know when we are not following the will that we do know in this book. And this is where we begin to find God's will, and the 1%. Yeah, I agree, Julio. I think takes care of itself basically. Once you're obeying all this, the other becomes pretty obvious, or we automatically find ourselves walking in the will of God there. So, I think that's exciting. I think it's exciting to know that God has a plan for my life. Think about it. My life has a purpose, not a purpose I came up with even, but a purpose that God came up with. I'm here for a reason. That can give you a reason to get up in the morning, that can give you a real purpose for living your life beyond just living for yourself, which is what our default is. If I don't think I have a greater purpose, I end up living just for myself, and I think life's all about making myself happy, doing what I want to do and that doesn't end well, usually. It doesn't really end in true happiness. We end up
disappointed.
Yeah, wait a minute. I thought this would make me happy. Yeah. And those things are things God adds to our lives. If we put him first, those things God doesn't keep us from.
All these things
he wants
us
to enjoy things. He adds them to us. Yeah. So they're to be added things. They're not to be the things that we pursue. We're to pursue him first and foremost.
Not to be foundational things.
Yes.
Extra stuff you do to your house.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, good way to put it. So here we are then with God bringing Esther and Mordecai to Persia again against their will, but that's where they find themselves now. The Persian king at the time was King Xerxes or Ahasuerus. Both of these names are found; they're the same person, though. The queen at the time was Vashti, or Vashti, however you want to say it. And in chapter 1, the king's throwing a big banquet, just basically to show off all his wealth and power. And at one point during the celebration, he calls for the Queen Vashti, to come to join the party and show off her beauty to the king, to the gathered guests there of the king. She refuses. We sort of started to speculate why she refused. Maybe she just was tired of being the token, beautiful wife, and she just didn't feel like going through that again. So she said, "I'm not coming." And as a result, of course, the king is enraged. He gets really mad. And then he consults with his officials and ends up removing her as queen and banishing her from the king's palace, and she's no longer the queen. And of course, this sets the stage then for a search then to be conducted throughout the empire, the Persian Empire, for the next queen. And this is where chapter 2 began last week. The only qualification, by the way, for the queen seems to be that she's the most beautiful woman they can find. The king had one qualification: I wanted to be the most beautiful woman on earth. And so that was the only thing they had to look for. By all accounts, Esther was that woman. She happened to be an exceptionally beautiful woman. Or I say happened to be. And again, we made this point last week. It wasn't that she happened to be this beautiful, more beautiful than all the other women, at least in the eyes of King Xerxes. God actually used her beauty, her physical beauty, as part of his plan for her life. That's why the king ultimately selected her to be queen. So we can't rule God using those kinds of things as well to direct us into his will. So she's the most beautiful woman and that he can find, and so he chooses her as the queen. So she becomes the new queen of Persia. And now this young orphan Jewish girl, think about it, becomes the queen of Persia. Who would have thunk, right? Who would have thought? And again, we need to stop and pause and say, wait a minute, that can only be God. Here's a girl, a foreign girl, a Jewish girl, already somewhat hated by the Persian people, orphaned, ripped from her homeland. How does she get to be queen? How does she get to be queen? Oh, it was just coincidence. No, it was God. Again, this brings us back to the whole theme of the book. It was God. It was God at work, and he elevated her to that position. I'm not even sure at the moment she realized that. In fact, I think it becomes clear she had an epiphany at some point where she realized that God has brought me here. But at this point, I'm not sure that she even knew.
Well, as you said, the will of God is often found in hindsight.
Yeah, it is.
So,
that's right.
So for her, it was probably no different.
Yeah.
At some point, she realized.
Well, Mordecai had to sort of
He
nudge her a little bit.
He nudged her a little bit.
Right. So again, our plans do not prevail over God's purposes. So we see God's purpose prevailing here in Esther's life. Chapter 2 then ends last week with Mordecai being in the right place at the right time and overhearing a plot, you remember, by two of the king's officials to assassinate the king. He, again, just happens to be right there where these two, I don't know how he happened to overhear them plotting that they were going to kill the king. Again, you have to say God had to be in that.
They're not very good whisperers.
Yeah, right.
We said that last week, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
Loud.
If you're going to be a gossiper, be quiet, gossiper.
Yeah, I'm going to be quiet about it.
So, of course, Mordecai reports this to the now Queen Esther, who he's still in somewhat communication with, and who in turn, Esther in turn informs the king, King Xerxes, of the plot, and he has the two men executed. And then the scripture records that this incident of Mordecai, this plot, and then Mordecai reporting it to the king, is recorded in the official record of the Persian kingdom. As again, we see again and again the Persians kept good record. So this incident was recorded. It was placed in the books, but then seemingly it was forgotten. And of course, we will find later on that God is in his providential way is going to bring this incident back into play in this entire story. We'll see that later on. But today we want to jump into chapter 3 to pick up the story where we left off, and Zach's going to read that for us today.
Okay, chapter 3. After all this took place, King Ahasuerus honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. He promoted him in rank and gave him a higher position than all the other officials. The entire royal staff at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, because the king had commanded this to be done for him. But Mordecai would not bow down or pay homage. The members of the royal staff at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" When they had warned him day after day, and he still wouldn't listen to them, they told Haman in order to see if Mordecai's actions would be tolerated, since he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing down or paying him homage, he was filled with rage. And when he had learned of Mordecai's ethnic identity, it seemed repugnant to Haman to do away with him, to do away with Mordecai alone. He planned to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout Ahasuerus' kingdom. In the first month, the month of Nisan, in King Ahasuerus' 12th year, the pur, that is, the lot, was cast before Haman for each day in each month, and it fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman informed King Ahasuerus, "There is one ethnic group scattered throughout the peoples in every province of your kingdom, keeping themselves separate. Their laws are different from everyone else's, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If the king approves, let an order be drawn up authorizing their destruction, and I will pay 375 tons of silver to the officials for deposit in the royal treasury." The king removed his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jewish people. Then the king told Haman, "The money and people are given to you to do with as you see fit." The royal scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and the order was written exactly as Haman commanded. It was intended for the royal satraps, the governors of each of the provinces, and the officials of each ethnic group, and written for each province in its own script, and to each ethnic group in its own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed with the royal signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to each of the royal provinces, telling the officials to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jewish people, young and old, women and children, and plunder their possessions on a single day, the 13th day of Adar, the 12th month. A copy of the text, issued as law throughout every province, was distributed to all the peoples so that they might get ready for that day. The couriers left, spurred on by royal command, and the law was issued in the fortress of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink while the city of Susa was in confusion.
Yes, so now enters the next major character in the story, and that is a man named Haman, who we've mentioned. And this man is honored, it says, by the king and elevated to the highest position in the kingdom next to the king himself. We're not told why Haman was elevated to this position, but he seemed like a kind of a political kind of player, and probably somehow or another got himself noticed by the king, and he got elevated to this position. We also find out he was a very, very wealthy man. That could have had something to do with it as well. You know, money can buy a lot of things, including position.
Yeah.
But it was a dream come true for this man Haman, and we know that because as we read the story about him, his character sort of becomes clear to us. As he'll see, he was someone who was all about power and position and personal glory. That was the character of this man. So this was the dream job. You know, the other than the king, he's the big cheese in the empire, and this would probably go to his head, being of the character that he was. Interestingly, Mordecai, who becomes the person who Haman absolutely hates the most in the kingdom, I guess in the world, is a man whose character is completely opposite of Haman's. This is why I think we underestimate Mordecai's role in this whole story. I think is at least of equal importance to the story as Esther is. Because he plays such key roles in everything that happens. But unlike Haman, Mordecai is a man who appears to be someone of real character, someone completely opposite of Haman. He was humble. He was a person of integrity. He was someone who wasn't concerned for his own glory, but what was best for his people, and I think also for the glory of God. He was a faithful Jew. That's what Mordecai was about. Now, when you have a Haman and you have a Mordecai, they're not going to be best buddies, right? No. When you have a person of this character who's all about the worldly way of doing things and power and politics and being noticed and position, that person generally doesn't get along well with a person who doesn't buy into all that stuff and who lives by the courage of their convictions and does the right thing instead of the political thing and doesn't care if people don't like him for doing the right thing. Those two characters generally don't get along well, and I think that is part of the clash that occurs between these two men. Haman hated Mordecai because he was a righteous man, and Haman was not a righteous man. And sometimes you think, well, if I do right, everybody will like me. Are you kidding me? The most perfect man who ever lived did perfect right. His name was Jesus, and they crucified him, right? You can do everything right and get a lot of hate from. In fact, the Bible says if you're not getting some hate, look out. Woe to you, he says, if all men speak well of you. And he goes on to say, if that's happening, you're a compromiser. You're a people pleaser. You've turned into a politician. You're afraid of conflict, even when it means standing up for what's right. I mean, Mordecai and Esther ultimately were willing to die, think about it, for doing what was right. They're willing to incur the wrath of the king and of Haman. They knew their life was on the line. And yet, what stands out is they honored God more than they honored the king or anyone else. And again, this is something we should aspire to have that kind of a character before God. So Haman had got the dream job in the king's court. Then we have this incident that just infuriates him, and that is that we find that Mordecai had stationed himself. Well, let me go back to the beginning here, verses 2 through 4. Haman had gotten the king to issue this order after he was appointed to his position, that all the royal officials were to kneel down to Haman and to pay honor to him, I guess whenever he passed by. That was and think about it. Haman got the king to make this law. This is this man's arrogance. King, and it also, again, impresses us with the idea how much of a pushover this king was, by the way. That comes up again and again and again. He went and followed along with it. He said, okay, go ahead. So he issues this edict, and everybody has to bow down to Haman whenever he passes by. Well, Haman, I got it. I love that. That fed into his whole ego thing. One man, though, in the entire kingdom, it seems like, of Persia, would not comply with this. He would not bow down or kneel down and pay honor to Haman. And that was, of course, Mordecai. And we're not told explicitly why Mordecai would not bow down to Haman, but there's a couple of, or a few possibilities, and one that's more likely than the others. One of them is that Haman, we talked about this last week, was a possibly a historical enemy of the Jews. He's known here as, or he's designated here as Haman the Agagite, which seems to be a reference to King Agag, who was the king of the Amalekites centuries earlier. And the Amalekites were historic enemies of Israel and the Jews, without going into the whole story again. And so Haman was a descendant of the Amalekites and King Agag, and Mordecai was a Jew. So it could be that the reason Mordecai would not bow down to Haman is because of that, and that Haman had such hatred toward Mordecai because he was a Jew, and there was this historical hatred between Haman's descendants and Mordecai's, or his, not his descendants, but his, what would that be, his antecedents? I don't know what you call
Ancestors.
Ancestors, thank you. Couldn't
Yes.
think of the word. So there's another tradition, and this is more or less a Jewish tradition, that that says Haman, and again, there's no biblical evidence for this. This sort of comes from rabbinical, the rabbis' writings, that Haman wore an idol around his neck, and this is why Mordecai would not bow down, because of course that would be breaking the first and second commandments. Really, you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make unto yourself any graven image. And so, to a Jew, that was sort of, rule number one. Faithful Jew, you do not. Thank you. Right, literally both went into. You can't bow down to idols, since he literally had this idol around his neck. The other thing is, there may have been some insinuation that by bowing to Haman himself, he was claiming to be somehow a god. And so to a faithful Jew, that would be unheard of. You remember Daniel would not bow down to King, I think it was Darius, wasn't it, or his idol, and refused to do it because Daniel was a faithful Jew, because that would have been to go against the commandments of God. But I think verse 4 probably indicates, at least in a general way, why Mordecai would not bow down to Haman. It simply says that he told them he was a Jew. Now again, that is included there for some reason. And I think, so in some general sense, it probably did have something to do with Mordecai being a Jew and bowing down to Haman. It could have been related to this historical hatred between them, but more than likely it was Haman did not want to pay homage to someone who was basically claiming to be a god, I think. Yeah,
one writer, I read this some time ago, suggested that the kind of bowing down that Haman was requiring was not just a courteous bow, kind of like Japanese people. They go like this in respect to the other person. But he was asking for them to bow down on their knees with their hands on the floor.
like worship.
Which is a posture of worship. And so it wasn't just like acknowledge you as a great leader or whatever.
Right.
Like that.
Disrespect. It was
Yeah.
it was worship.
Throw yourself on the ground,
Yeah, it says kneel down and pay honor. So this was specified in this edict that was issued. So yeah, I think, again, Haman is the one who got the king to write the edict. I'm sure he probably wanted to be worshipped.
Yeah.
I mean, just knowing the man, and it's very likely that's what was happening here. Mordecai understood that and would not do it. Again, this put his life at risk. And again, it highlights again his character. Now, the other officials, it says at the king's gate here, where apparently all the officials hung out, because the king's gate appears a lot in the story, tried to get Mordecai to comply. At least it seems like they did. It says day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply, refused to bow down and obey this law. why don't you just cooperate, Mordecai?
Why are you stubborn?
What's the big deal? Yeah, why not just go along with it? Why are you going to cause all these potential problems for yourself? Now, see, that's the way some people look at a situation like this. Well, it's not that big of a deal. But if you're a person like Mordecai, who's a person of principle, he's a person of character. He's someone who decided, God is the one I honor above all others. People like that don't understand why you're standing on your principle. Or you're just being stubborn. You're just being stubborn. It's just going to cause problems in the family. Just go along with it. Come on, we can all think of those circumstances. Sometimes you got to cause problems in the family for doing what's right. We can't calculate. We think, well, that'll cause trouble. No, it didn't. In the end, Mordecai was vindicated. It turned out for good. What we think is going to cause, if we're trying to figure it all out ourselves, no, we're just supposed to do what's right. In every situation. Let God worry about how it's all going to turn out. My goodness, you won't be able to get any sleep trying to figure out how's this going to turn out. How's this going to turn out? Like we have the responsibility to calculate everything. No, we don't have that responsibility. We have the responsibility to do what's right in each circumstance in the eyes of God and let Him work out the details of it. Even if in some interim period it seems to cause more problems than not. We think everything is all about keeping the peace, keeping equilibrium. No, that's not really what it's about when it comes between that and doing what's right. See, that's what creates a compromiser. Someone who keeps the peace at any cost, even the cost of what's right and the truth. And we've got to be people who are willing to say, everybody has to have to like me all the time. If you're a person who has to have someone like you all the time, you're going to be a people pleaser and you're going to compromise what's right. Now, we're to be people who, insofar as we can, are to promote and keep peace. I'm not saying we should be intentional troublemakers, but when it comes down to a conviction we have before God to do what's right in His eyes and to compromise, we need to choose to do the right thing. We're forced in our culture more and more as Christians to go along. This is important, I think, right now, just culturally speaking, where we, you're going to create problems. Well, guess what? Jesus created problems by doing what was right, didn't He? So again, doing what's right does not mean it's always going to have people are going to respond positively to it. Sometimes the opposite happens.
I think of the words of Jesus when He said, I didn't come to bring peace,
Yeah.
but I came to bring the sword.
Yeah, the Prince of Peace said that.
Yeah, a family member against family member. Remember he made that statement?
Yeah. Oh, exactly. He's talking about family. Yeah, the Prince of Peace said, I didn't come to bring peace. Well, that must be that must be a error in the text, yes.
Must be a misprint.
No, guess what? You can't do it, can you? Have you ever tried? Oh, I'll keep the peace. You're in the middle, and everybody you're just getting beat up because you're trying to keep everybody at peace. You can't do it. You can't do it. And so, we have to defer to what's right in the situation, and what's right is what we should be committed to. And sometimes that creates a rumble as opposed to peace in the immediate in the present. But again, we have to trust that in the end, see, this is what doing right is all about. In the end, because God is always on the side of right, it will all turn out for the best. That's why we can do what's right, even if in the short term it may not be easy. Because we are trusting that God is going to work it all out in the end. So Mordecai would not go along to get along, and this is why he set himself apart and, again, created problems for himself. There was something more important to him than not rocking the boat. Come on, sometimes you got to rock the boat. Again, if your main principle in life is, I just don't want to rock the boat, whatever. But it was honoring God. That was Mordecai's principle. doing what's right, standing up on principle. Again, if you do that today, sometimes you're called a bigot. Well, you're just a bigot. You're as narrow-minded. Don't let people intimidate you with that stuff because you stand up on principle and won't compromise. Well, you're like these other king's officials. Just go along, Mordecai. Come on. You don't want to create problems for yourself and other people. No. Sometimes we need to stand up on principle. So I think this, by the way, be another theme in this whole book. That is doing right under all circumstances. We see that in Mordecai. We see it in Esther. Knowing what your principles are. See, that's where it begins. Some people don't even know what their principles are. So how do I know when I've reached the line where I can't cross over that line? If I don't know what I stand for, if I don't know what the non-negotiables are, there are some things that are negotiable. You want to do as much as you can to get along, but then you get to the point, and that is non-negotiable. For Daniel, it was, I'm not going to eat non-kosher food. I'm not going to bow down to an idol. He complied as far as he could up to that point, but then he said, no, that's the line. Not going to do it. So we need to know where that line is for ourselves. And honestly, it might be a little different for some of us because it comes down here to personal conviction too. There can be some variation on that, and we have to respect where a person's personal conviction is on something. I've often brought up the illustration. If you've brought up in the Pentecostal church, like I was, not too many years ago, you couldn't walk into a movie theater; you were going to hell. Or you couldn't wear women couldn't wear pants. Let's check the ladies here today. Well, obviously that's changed. Or makeup, or jewelry, or and now to us, we laugh, and I do too now. But at some point in time, people did that because they had a personal conviction about it. Unfortunately, something like that turns into a religious thing over time. But if there's on an individual level, if someone decides I don't want to go into a movie theater because I want to honor God in that way, we need to respect that person for doing that. And so I'm not making fun of individuals who make personal choices about where they're going to draw that line. We all need to do that. Yours might be a little different than mine. I might find it okay to go into a movie theater and not watch some X-rated movie, but watch I was going to say a Disney movie, but some of their movies are not are in question now. So you know what I'm saying, but something that would not overtly break, go against what we know we're to do and how we're to live as Christians. But there's some room for tolerance there between us. But in any case, we need to know what our principles are based on the Word of God, and then also at a personal level, what God is calling me to, where He's calling me to draw the line. Maybe it's a personal weakness. For instance, if you maybe have had trouble with alcohol in the past, guess what? It's probably a good idea not to go into the bar, right? Now, for me, it might be okay. That happens to not be my vice, and so I don't really have a problem going in the bar. I don't, if I need to get some change or whatever. If you see me going in there, I'm just going to get some change. I'm telling you that story because that actually happened to me one time. There's a liquor store. I need some change. Yeah, sure. Yeah, and the deacon just hadn't be driving by. But but for a person who that may have been a difficulty for, wisdom would say that's where I need to draw the line for me. And so we need to all come up with those areas, and so Mordecai drew these lines. And so the theme is we do what's right under all circumstances. Know what your principles are, and then be willing, really, to die for them. This is what Mordecai and Esther were. Do you agree there are some principles that are worth dying for, even? We are not usually pushed to that point in this country, but in other parts of the world, Christians are. And so we should think about these things. This theme is about courage, showing the courage of your conviction. Think how courageous Mordecai and Esther were, really. Again, putting their own life on the line for the sake of their people. And being willing to make enemies in the process. This is when you stand on principle, you're going to make enemies. Because there's going to be somebody who is opposite of your principles. And they're going to... So the reason sometimes, again, we don't want to take a stand is because we don't want to make enemies. And the Bible says that's not good. That's not a good position to put yourself in. We're not looking for enemies. We're not looking to cause trouble. On the other hand, there are some principles that we cannot compromise on. We have to take the stand there, and there's going to be somebody who's not going to like it. So it's why the evil, unprincipled Haman hated Mordecai. I believe it is because Mordecai stood on principle, and he pledged his highest loyalty to God, and Haman couldn't take that. I want you to bow down to me. And Mordecai said, "Oh, can't do it. Nope, can't do it. I bow down to one God, and only one, and you're not it." And Haman couldn't take that. Now, remember also when Mordecai refused to bow down, he was technically breaking the law because the king had issued this edict. So it was actually law. So it wasn't just an issue with Haman, it was actually an issue with the king, although I don't think the king really cared that much about it. He just did it because Haman wanted him to do it.
Seems as though the king didn't really know what he was putting into law.
Yeah, the king just seemed to go along with his advisors, and yeah, that sounds good. Where's the next beautiful woman? And the king, bring her in. Yeah. That seemed to be where his head was most of the time. So it was, not about running the kingdom. Now, apparently Haman had not yet noticed that Mordecai was not complying with this edict at first, because if you read there, it says these other officials went to Haman and told him that Mordecai's not bowing down to you. We're going to tell on Mordecai. So again, we see another one of these power plays going on here. We bring this again and again back. There's all this power playing going on. Everybody's trying to get in their position. That means stepping on someone else if you have to get yourself up there. So they're trying to really get Mordecai here. It looks like they're concerned about him, but they're not. I don't believe they go to Haman and say, "Hey, the Mordecai guy, he's not bowing down to you." And of course, that's all Haman needed to hear.
Maybe the officials are mad at Mordecai for tattling on the two officials in the last chapter. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe they're trying to get back. Maybe
if they knew that. Yeah, that could be.
Hey, look what this guy did.
We might. He might tell on us next or something. Yeah. It's interesting, the phraseology here in verse 4. It says, "Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew." And I'm going to bring that up later. But I think what's underlying this is that they were trying to get Haman to punish Mordecai. They were out to get him. I don't think they were trying to save him. They were trying to get him. Somebody can act like they're trying to save you when they're really trying to get you. And I think that's where these guys were. Now, verses 5 and 6, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down, he was, of course, what? Enraged. Why? Because Mordecai was breaking the law? Was that what Haman was worried about? No, I don't think it was a legal thing.
Broke his law.
Yeah, broke his ego, right? Haman, again, was all about power, pride, being honored. Admittedly, we're speculating on these things, so we're kind of tying everything together here. So I'm not speaking I don't know what was exactly in Haman's head. But again, I think we can speculate pretty reliably here about what was going on. Just because he was all about this power, pride, being honored. Maybe it was also about being paranoid. Again, if you're in a position of power, you're always concerned someone's out to get your job. That's why we shouldn't aspire to positions of power. We think it's a wonderful thing. No, it's not all the time, because then you got to, who's trying to get my job now? Better just being the grunt down here and don't have to worry about that stuff, than the guy up here. But he might have been afraid that Mordecai was challenging his position by not bowing down to him. And a guy like this, I could see probably having those paranoid kinds of thoughts, right? I don't think this was Mordecai's motive. There's nothing that indicates it was. Ironically, though, that's exactly what happens. Mordecai ends up being elevated by the king, not by his own design, but by the king. He gets Haman's job after Haman is executed, as the story unfolds. So again, was that coincidence? No. Again, God was at work. Again, you don't see Mordecai manipulating this. He's not one of these people who's playing the political game. He's just doing God's will. And in the end, who wins? The guy who's on God's side wins. Even though all these other people are trying to make it happen by their own, manipulations and so forth. Haman ends up hung, and Mordecai is in his office, sitting at his desk now. And another reason, though, reveals itself here as to why Haman was enraged, and that was, again, verse 6, he learned who Mordecai's people were. So this goes back, that is, he was a Jew. And again, this hails back to the fact that Haman was possibly a descendant of the Amalekites, who were historical enemies of Israel. So there was this built-in hatred, possibly, that Haman had for Mordecai. Now, obviously, then at this point, though, in the story, it becomes about more than just Mordecai. Mm-hmm. Because if we read here, and this is, remember that passage in at the Last Supper when Judas dips the bread into the thing, and Jesus says, "Do what you must do," and I think John records at that point, Satan entered Judas. He became possessed, basically, by the devil at that point. I think if there's a point in the narrative where that happened to Haman, there's evidence that it's right here, because here he's offended by this one Jew, Mordecai, but look what happens after that. It says, yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, verse 6, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people. In other words, all the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes.
This is escalated quickly.
Yeah, this is
from just dislike of Mordecai to now it's like, you know what? I don't like any of them now.
Right. This is a little literally overkill. You talk about overkill. This is literally, a response disproportionate to being offended by one man, which says it's taken on a spiritual character at this point in time. The devil has essentially, in my opinion, entered into the equation here, literally entered into Haman. And we see this throughout history with the Jews. I mean, look at Hitler. Have you seen some of those speeches of Hitler with those thousands, maybe millions of people? And he seems possessed. I know a little German. I can't understand everything he's saying, but I don't have to understand the German to understand this guy's. This is a demon speaking through this man. This is the devil who's inspiring these people to Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler. So there was at some point a spiritual power that entered into that situation with Hitler and the Nazi Party and all that, and we see that, I think, happening here. This was essentially, another attempted Holocaust of the Jewish people. And again, this has happened throughout history, going back to even Moses and the Pharaoh. And it's a spiritual thing.
So wipe out the Jewish line because the Messiah would come.
It's all about Jesus. Yeah, it's all about Jesus. That's the hated race, because that's the one through whom the Messiah would come. Because you wonder, anti-Semitism, where does it come from? Ultimately, it's illogical. It's illogical. Now, people will give reasons why they hate Jewish people. It's on the rise again in the world, in Europe more especially, and even here. Anti-Semitism. Why? It's a spiritual thing. There's a spiritual element to this, because these are God's people. They have they play a key role in God's plan. The Messiah came through this people, and they even have a key role to play in the future, according to prophecy. God's not done with Israel yet, and so the devil, at some level, knows this, and he's still trying to intervene, to try to, in some way, maybe foil God's plans. So it's whenever some people's actions seem irrational and there's hate for no reason at all. Often there's a spiritual element that has entered there, and I think we see that going on here. So he decides, okay, this is my chance. I'm not only going to get back at this guy Mordecai, who's a Jew. I'm going to find a way to have all of his people annihilated, killed. And then we begin in verse 7, in the 12th year of King Xerxes. By the way, this would mean Esther had been queen for about 5 years at this point, so some time had passed. And it says that Haman, the poor, P-U-R, was cast in the presence of Haman. The poor, we talked about this in the introduction to the book of Esther, that the poor is a lot. Like they used to cast lots to make decisions, or sometimes determine the will of the gods, or whatever it was, in a pagan setting. But and poor, P-U-R, is where the celebration of the festival of Purim comes from, which is celebrated in March, I think April of each year, we said. And that festival is a celebration of God's deliverance of the Jewish people from the evil Haman, from being annihilated, and how he gave victory to the Jewish people over their enemies. So that comes from this very verse here, where Haman cast the poor, or the lot. What was he doing that for? To determine a day on which this mass annihilation of the Jewish people in the Persian Empire would occur. In other words, here's another evidence that this was really inspired by the devil. He didn't want to only wipe out Mordecai. He didn't only want to wipe out every Jew. He wanted to do it in a single day, on a single day. Think about it. Yeah. Well, how are you going to do that? Well, he basically did it by having the king agree to have all the other non-Jewish people in the empire on that day turn against their Jewish neighbors. We'll get to that in a minute. But again, it's just really an evil plot when you think about it. Haman's idea was to have all the Jews massacred on a single day. Again, why a single day? Again, I guess just for the drama of it. I can't think of any other reason. It's just inspired of the devil.
He might have been afraid of some kind of pushback if he didn't get it done right.
Maybe. It's important to realize, again, it wasn't a military campaign. He was getting citizens. He didn't ask the king to send the army to kill the Jews. He said his plan was have their neighbors turn against them. What a terrible thing. These are probably your friends. These Jewish people, they lived next to you. They were your friends. Now it was under law. You were supposed to turn on them and massacre them from adult down to babies. What a situation to put people in.
That happened in Africa with the Houthis, I think they're called. Remember that incident where neighbor turned against neighbor and they chopped them up with machetes? People that lived together. Remember that incident? I don't know if you guys.
Years ago, yeah.
I forget, one of them called the Houthis. I forget what the other tribe was. But
yeah.
They lived together in the same neighborhood, and one tribe turned against the other and just killed neighbors. Slaughtered them completely.
Amazing. So the lot fell on the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar on the Jewish calendar. That was 11 months from the time that the lot was cast. So there was 11 months between the time that the lot was cast and the day was determined that this annihilation was going to occur and the time that it actually was carried out. 11 months. It didn't happen the next day. So can you imagine? If you're a Jew,
just having to sit there for 11 months.
Knowing the exact day.
Yeah.
And as well as the other people who were there. Now, I thought to myself, well, if I was a Jew and I knew I had 11 months, I'm leaving.
Bye.
So there may have been an exodus. I don't know. There's no indication in the passage that there was. But it would seem rational that if I knew that I was going to be killed and that the king had issued this edict and all Jews were going to be killed on this certain date and I'm a Jew, I better get out of town before that date
11
happens.
months is a good time frame to sell my house.
Yeah. I've been thinking about moving anyway. I think this is the time to make the move. But again, nothing says that. But again, if we're just going by human nature,
Logic
and reason, yeah,
logic.
you would think that probably took place. But just going to verse 8 and 9, Haman, before this actually, he has to sell the king on this idea, this plot of his. And again, it's not hard. The king's a pushover. Again, we see it here again. The king just seems to go along with whatever wild idea his advisors have, and he does the same thing here. But let's look how Haman tries to sell this plan to King Xerxes. He starts by saying in verse 8, there is a certain people. That's interesting, isn't it? In fact, he never mentions in this whole explanation to the king Jews. Never mentions Mordecai. He keeps it kind of vague. I think he's trying to just, again, push, make the king say, yeah, whatever you want to do. So he doesn't get too specific. He just, I'm a busy man, Haman. Just what? Oh yeah, go ahead and do it. No, that's almost, I think, what he's looking for. So he doesn't get into. He says a certain people. Mm-hmm. Now, don't forget that Esther, Queen Esther, the king's wife, or one of his main people, is a Jew. Yes, she is a Jew. Now, she has not yet revealed this under counsel by Mordecai. We find out earlier there in chapter 2 that he told her, don't let, when she became queen, don't let him know you're a Jew. He already had some idea that this would not put her in a proper position. Now there's going to come a point where Mordecai counsels her just the opposite. He says, you need to reveal that you're a Jew, because now that's going to be the key to saving all your people. Again, there's a little principle there. In some circumstance, one thing is right, and in another circumstance, the opposite is right. We're talking about doing right in every circumstance. At one point, it was right for Esther to keep her ethnicity concealed. It was, or at least wise, to do that. But there came a point where principle had to prevail. And if she was going to save the people of her Jewish people, Mordecai said, you have to let the king know you're a Jew. Basically, so that because he favors you, he will show favor to your people. Hopefully. There's no guarantee of this. But hopefully. So, again, it's interesting how when we're talking about standing by principle, depending on the circumstance, the principle can even change. I mean, in this case, it reversed. There's a certain circumstance where this is right, and there's a circumstance where taking the other position is the right thing to do. So we need wisdom in those circumstances. So Haman portrays the Jews as a rebellious and a potential threat to the king and the kingdom of Persia.
It's interesting that Haman uses language that makes it look like he's looking out for the king. King, it's not in your best interest that you tolerate them.
Yeah, we know Haman's looking out for one person's interest, right?
It's not in your best interest that you tolerate them. If the king approves, let an order be drawn up.
Yes.
So just the
very political language.
Yes,
very political language. So this guy's an expert at schmoozing, shall we say, or whatever you want to call it.
Yep, and probably the most interesting piece to me is that he's willing to pay for this to happen. And I think that might be what says, all right, well, if I don't have to pay for this king, and you want to pay for it, okay.
It also says if you're willing to part with your money, you really believe in something. So he was really serious about this as well. Plus he was leaving no reason for the king to say no.
I'll pay for it.
Sure. I'll fund the whole thing. He goes on to say, they keep themselves separate. Well, that's what God's people are supposed to do, isn't it? In the world?
Yep.
That's what the word holy means. Yep. That's what the whole Old Testament law was about. It was about maintaining his own people and keeping them separate from these nations around them. That's why you have all those laws in the Old Testament. It made Israel stand out. And again, because they stood out, they were often hated. And this, again, there's an application to us as Christians here in the world. If we're going to be holy, and again, I hesitate to use that word because we have all these pictures of what a holy person is, But a holy person means, let's just say, one who honors God first in everything, right? When it comes between what the world says I should do and what I do what God says, well, guess what? When you start to really live like that, the world necessarily doesn't, you don't get along with everybody because you're running against the grain of the world system and the value system of the world. But that's what we're called to do. Holy, if we're going to be holier people, it means to be separate. You're going to stand out. And guess what? It's not human nature to want to stand out, is it? We like to belong. We like to be we like to be liked. We like to be part of the crowd. Who likes to stand out? You know, just get along. Well, again, we have to be willing, if we're going to have God first, to stand out from the crowd sometimes. And people look at us weird and not want to associate with us and those kinds of things. You just have to there's no way around it. And this is, of course, what Haman is sort of really using against the Jews. He says they keep themselves separate. In other words, and again, this is probably true. They probably kept kosher laws, for instance. They only ate certain foods, and that's weird. Why don't they eat pig? Why don't they eat pork? Bacon's the best thing in the world. How come these people don't eat it? What kind of people are these anyway? It's racism. It can start out because they're different. We hate them, and that's what is at the core of racism. Any kind of racism, we hate difference. And that's why, again, as God's people, when we try to live in the world, we're hated. Now, we're not ethnically, but we are a spiritual race of people, and that stand out because of the way that we conduct our lives in this world, and for that reason, sometimes just because of that, we're hated. I mean, you've all run into it. I run into it this week. I can think of a situation where I'm thinking, because I'm a Christian, there's this level of, I don't know what it was. And if it wouldn't have been known I was a Christian, I could have talked to this guy and we'd have been fine. But because I was a Christian and that was known, it was like we're walking on eggshells or something. And you know what I'm talking about, all those kinds of situations, right? And we have to be willing to bear that if we're going to be Christians, right? We have to be willing to okay, it's not the most important thing in the world. And that's a really small thing compared to what the Jews at this time were facing. But God's purpose was that to keep his people separate from the world, again, holy, in the world but not of the world, right? That's our status as Christians in the world, to keep separate from the world, and that's what to be holy means, and that means honoring God above all. Now, Christians today are trying to live faithful lives. If we're trying to do that, I see it happening in our own country, and I'm not an alarmist here, but I don't have my head in the sand either. Sometimes Christians more and more in this are being characterized as non-compliant, rebellious even, bigots, and a threat to the government. Has you heard all those, more or less, and they're sort of at a somewhat of a low level now, but they're increasing. I think of the pastors during the COVID crisis who refused to comply with the government guidelines in terms of gathering in their churches. Now, I have my own opinions on that. But they were characterized not in nice ways. They're against the government. I don't think these pastors were against the government. I think, even though I didn't agree with all of how they went about it, they were trying to live by their biblical convictions. They weren't against the government. But that's how they were characterized. Oh, these Christians, they're a threat. There's a similarity here. I don't think that's a stretch to say that. How about the bakery owner? This is a popular case a few years ago, who wouldn't make a wedding cake for a homosexual couple who was getting married. Remember that case? How awful those two Christians were, for goodness sake. They wouldn't bake a cake for homosexual marriage. Well, they weren't being mean to these people, as far as I know. They were polite to them. They simply said, this is against our convictions. And just to say that, they're characterized in the press and everything else as these strange, weird, out of touch, Christians. And if we don't identify that, we got our head in the sand about it. I'm not saying let's go to war about it. I'm simply saying you don't have your eyes open if you don't see it, and the comparison. These couple was sued. As far as I know, they were put out of business, and that's only one of many cases like that. And I'm not saying, again, let's go. I'm saying, as Christians, honestly, when we stand up for Christ, that is our lot in this world. We should, poor me, I'm being persecuted. Jesus said we're going to be persecuted. So I'm not on the side of these, poor us. If we live for Christ truly in this world and stand by the courage of our convictions, it's going to run against the grain of some people, and we're going to incur their wrath. They're not going to like us. They're going to sue us. They're going to call us names. And the question for us is, how do I respond to that?
Yeah.
How do I respond to that? Well, you know how we're supposed to respond? Love, right? Everybody agree to that? Yeah. Not hate. We're to expect that to happen, but even expecting that, we need to know. But my response is not to return hatred for hatred. If I'm going to be a follower of Jesus, I'm called to love those people who hate me. And that's ultimately, if anything will win, that's what will win. Don't you agree? Not going to war with people, not hating people, but loving people who hate us. What's it? Martin Luther King would just put the post up, that quote of his. He said, do you remember? Hate doesn't cast out hate. Only love can cast out hate. Or something like that was the quote. You can't fight hate with hate. You can only fight hate truly with love. That's the only way you can overcome hate, is to love it, is to love those who hate you. And so I think it's important that we get all that straight. We recognize these things. I'm not saying, therefore, we should get angry and bitter and all that. I'm saying we should love them if we're going to follow Jesus and realize this is part of our lot in life as we live for Christ in this world. Time we got? Okay, we've got a few more minutes. We'll try to wrap up here. He says their customs, Haman says this, again, still trying to sell this plot to the king. Their customs are different from those of other people. Now, to me, this is blatant racism, is what he's talking about here. Again, they aren't like us. They're different. They don't fit in. They don't wear the kind of clothes we wear. They don't, do what we do.
Do things differently than we do.
They do things differently than we do. They're not one of us. And therefore, on that basis, we should wipe them all off of the planet. Anyway. He says then they're breaking the king's laws. Well, that was a lie. Up to this point, it's what he's basically been saying is in effect true. We don't have any evidence they're breaking the king's law except one. And that was the law that Haman got the king to issue, that everyone would bow down to him. So again, what's it about? Is it about the king and the interests of the kingdom? No, it's about Mordecai. It's about Haman. It's all about him. And of course, the king didn't bother to say what other laws. He just went along with it, and believed that they were this rebellious people. And it was only one man breaking one law, in actual fact, against another man, Haman, that really was behind all this. He then goes on to say, it's verse 4, it's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. Now notice this word tolerate, at least in my text, comes up the second time it's come up. It was also in verse 4, where the officials are saying to Mordecai at that point in time,
will his behavior be tolerated?
Yeah. They told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated. Again, it's an interesting way to phrase it, isn't it? Well, I think there's a reason for that. It was the Persian way. If you know Persian history, when they conquered people, their subjected peoples, it was their policy to be tolerant with those people. As compared, for instance, to the Roman Empire that basically crushed the people who they conquered, the Persians allowed them to basically live in their own cultural
tolerance of their customs
in their
ways of
local
doing
area.
things.
So you had this certain group over here who had certain customs, and the Persians, as long as it did not pose a threat, ultimately to the empire, they would allow them to live. If you were a Jew, you were allowed to live like a Jew and live out your customs or some other custom from whatever country you were from. So that was the sort of the Persian policy. Again, unlike the Romans, as a comparison. In fact, if you might have heard of the Greek historian Herodotus, who we have a lot of history of this time from. He says this: he said this: no race is more ready to adopt foreign customs than the Persians. So you'll notice also they didn't expect their subject peoples to learn the Persian language, because when the king issued the edict, he had it issued in the script of all of the various languages. So a lot of other empires, if they would make their subject people learn the language. Again, it was basically to wipe their identity out as a people. So you speak our language. As we said, Haman puts his money where his mouth is. So he does offer, I'll pay for this mass extermination of these Jewish people. I heard it estimated that what he was offering, now this is almost unbelievable, was 2/3 of basically the budget of the entire kingdom of Persia. What this says is Haman was a very wealthy man. I mean, beyond anything. So he had the money to do this. And again, as we pointed out, the two reasons, it just emphasizes how much hatred he had, that he was willing to put up that kind of money to have the Jews annihilated. It was also, again, a way that he felt he could ensure that the king would approve of his plan. There would be no financial reason.
If you don't spend my money, then
yeah.
whatever you want.
No economic reason for the king not to go along with this. So he puts his money where his mouth is. Now, some translations actually have it that the king says, don't spend your own money. That's all right. Mm-hmm. Keep your money and just do it anyway. So there's a couple of different ways to translate this.
Actually, here in verse 11 in this translation, it says, "Then the king told Haman, the money and people are given to you to do what you see fit." Yeah,
and that's one translation. So we don't know if Haman actually spent his money or the king said, "It's all right, the kingdom will pay for it." But we don't know.
Nonetheless, he was willing to pay.
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah. That's the point. Now, verses 10 through 15 to wind up today. The edict, again, was for all non-Jews on a single day to turn on the Jews. So, the king obviously approves of this plan. So, and the plan was that he issued this edict that all non-Jews on a single day turn on their Jewish neighbors in the provinces of the Persian kingdom and kill them. Adults and babies alike, and everybody in between. Again, it was not a military campaign. It was turning neighbor against neighbor. And what would motivate this to happen? Well, one of the things was, if you notice verse 13, it says, and to plunder their goods. So now there's two ways to take that. This could mean that, hey, people, you can kill these Jews and take their houses and take all their stuff. In other words, as an incentive for them to do it. It could mean, though, that what that means is you need to plunder these Jews and then turn it all over to the king. But I think it seems like it's just a way to motivate them to do it. Hey, you can keep their stuff. If you kill them. So the date is placed on the calendar. It's 11 months. Again, you would think the Jews would have fled. Nothing said that they did, but many of them, I think, might have. And again, you could say, well, maybe this was the idea that Haman just wanted them out of the country, out of the empire. He seemed more intent on just having them killed, though. And then the final verse of the chapter, the final phrase actually, is kind of leaves us hanging. Yes. It says, the king and Haman sat down to drink. So we need a drink after this plan. Yeah.
like,
It's kind of like to soothe your conscience or to put it all. I mean, it just shows you're trying to block it out. I guess.
I can picture a scene in a movie where just these two guys are maybe sitting out on an outdoor patio type thing while the city is just going berserk and the city's in total confusion, and these guys are just sitting there with a beverage in their hand, just watching it all unfold.
Right. What does it mean that the city? Again, this is the actual annihilation. This day has not occurred. This is just after the plan was made. So, what was the bewilderment or the confusion that was going on there in the city of Susa, the capital city? Maybe it was just disbelief that such a thing was being put into motion. That we're expected to kill our neighbors. That would be maybe bewildering. And some suggest that the Persian people had higher morals than their leadership did. They could not imagine such a thing would happen. The other, and I don't know if there's any truth, but when the word confusion comes up, it always reminds me of God is not right.
Yeah.
The God of confusion. Who is?
Yep.
The devil. So it could be simply again a reminder. The devil was behind this. He's motivating and driving this entire thing. So the plot thickens. We'll pick up chapter 4 next week.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Hope you join us next week for chapter 4 as we see Mordecai now appeal to Esther, and this is where we have the famous line of the entire book in chapter 4. So join us for that. Also, this Sunday we have a special guest in our 11 a.m. Worship experience. Dan Hess will be here to share with us during our service time. We hope to see you there. We'll be online and in person for that service as well. Until then, God bless you, and we'll see you soon.